Hi, and welcome to this episode of Family Conversations. My name is Jimmie Manning. I am chair and professor at the University of Nevada, Reno. And today I am very excited to have with me Dr. Robin Boylorn from the University of Alabama. Dr. Boylorn earned her PhD from the University of South Florida and is a professor of interpersonal and intercultural communication. And a lot of her work deals with social identity and diversity, primarily the lived experiences of Black women. Her first book, Sweetwater, Black Women and Narratives of Resilience, is one of my all-time favorite books. I was at a seminar recently and they said, what is your favorite book in the communication discipline? And Sweetwater just rolled off the tongue as the one that I really enjoy. So I might be a little smitten during this interview today. Not only because of Sweetwater, but which, by the way, that book has won tons of awards, but Robin herself is someone who gets around on media and has opinions to share. She's been on Slate, Ebony, The Guardian, Salon, Gawker, the Crunk Feminist Collective, which she's a big part of, and now she's here at Family Conversations. So welcome, Dr. Boylorn.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
All right, so we're going to get right into the first question. And so what I always want to know on this show first is, how did you get to family communication? And by that, I mean, what was it that got you into studying families or thinking about families, or kind of where you are now as a family communication scholar?
Okay, great. So I would say that what got me interested in families is my overall interest in investment in Black women. You know, I was raised by Black women, and like most people in my community, our families were matrifocal, meaning they were headed by women and not men. And that was always something that I found research would discuss that through an orient of deviation or deficiency. And I was really interested in thinking about challenging that, you know, like challenging canonical ways of thinking about what family looks like, particularly by including and centering Black families, you know. So how does the structure of Black families views of family life? So that was my initial investment. And I've been really interested in how Black families are depicted writ large, like through social media and popular culture, you know. So like most Black people that I know, I was an avid watcher of The Cosby Show, because it was this representation of a Black family that was aspirational, but also in some ways problematically colorblind. And so comparing, for example, a family like the Huxtables to a family like the family that the Evanses, which was centered on the show Good Times, you can see that not only the class dynamics, but the racialized dynamics and how families were represented. So I was interested in contributing to that conversation and challenging it a little bit.
Now, your book is very personal. You say that it is semi-autoethnographic, and of course it's written in a narrative style that's really engaging. So can you tell me a little bit about the autoethnography of that and what autoethnography is and how that came into Sweetwater?
Yes, so ethnography, as we know, is a study of culture, and autoethnography is essentially a method that allows the researcher to study themselves in the context of culture. So when we think about families as co-cultures, I think that my approach to autoethnography when studying my community and immediate family had a lot to do with me considering it something that Chris Poulos has called an ethnographic autoethnography, because, you know, the stories were compiled from participant observation, interactive interviews, and immersion into the culture, or I should say re-immersion into the culture. And then I translated those interviews into stories, and then I told my versions of those stories. So it was important for me to center the stories that emerged from my encounters with the women in the community, and then to tell my version of that story from my experience growing up in that same community.
Yeah, and what I love about the book is there are like poems after each chapter, and you always bring a lot of artistic qualities into your work. And so could you talk a little bit about that? I know autoethnography in general has some artistic elements, but I think you take it to another level. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, so I am, and I apologize if you hear that ringing, it's my dog, one of my dogs So I apologize. You're ringing in the background. I should have taken those collars off. But so I've always been what I would consider a creative. And I think as a scholar, I've come into that more as like a critical creative, right? I've always enjoyed poetry, and I'm somewhat of a language snob. So before I was a communication scholar, I was a creative writing student. So I was an English major and a communication studies major as an undergraduate. And so one of the things that I've always been invested in is the power and beauty of words, and the lyricism of words. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so enamored with Black culture and Black language, particularly rural Black language, like all of the country sayings and ways of speaking that are both beautiful and different. You know, like your ear has to bend a particular toward those words to get the beauty of them. And it's not something that I always recognized when I lived there, but it's definitely something that I can pick up on elsewhere. So I like to use some of those same language mechanisms in my poetry, where I'm using repetition, where I'm using lyricism. You know, a lot of my prose work will find a way to incorporate some type of alliteration, or like because I think that when I'm writing the words, I have to hear them first. Like, how does this sound, and how does it fall off your tongue? So I oftentimes think of my written word as spoken. So what will it sound like? So one thing when it hits the page, but what happens when it hits the voice? So I think that sometimes I think I'm someone who does poetry. I don't necessarily identify as a poet, because I feel like that's disrespectful for people who are poets, and that's their everything, because I don't feel like I write enough poetry to consider myself a poet. But when I feel inspired, there's nothing like being able to play with words and play off of words, and then throw that into an academic context to shake things up a little bit. I enjoy that a lot. And I think it also invites accessibility in a particular way, so that you can translate something that might be full of jargon, or it might be overly complicated. And I think that using poetry can help simplify and amplify some of those things.
Great. And if you want to see some of Robin's poetry, you can go to her homepage, and that is in the links. So check that out. Just a great example of a homepage for scholars in general. A lot of scholars have websites, and so yours looks really great. Let's talk a little bit. So one of the things that is really cool about Sweetwater is it's family communication, but it's not all family communication. There's a lot of things there. It brings in the artistic. And so one of the things I really appreciate about your book is I think it pushes the boundaries of what family communication is and what it can be. And so I'd like to go there for a second, and not necessarily about your work, but just maybe in the field more generally. Where do you think family communication studies is heading, or where do you think it should be heading? And what do you think is next or should be next for family communication studies?
So I think that, family communication studies, like a lot of subfields within our discipline, suffers from a lack of diversity or diverse representation. And I mean that not just in terms of representation of identity, but also representation of scholarship, right? So I think that a lot of times when we read family communication scholarship, it's presented in a way that's traditional and social science centered. And so I think that one of the ways, or one of the moves, or where the future of family is going or can go, is to, of course, things that work and keep those keep the quantitative methodologies that help inform what we understand about families, but also think about ways of representing families differently, representing scholarship differently, that will invite us to not just focus on generalized ideas and theories about families, but specific and generalizable experiences of families, and think about families that are not normatively or naturally white, right? So what does it mean to think about family structures that are quote unquote non-normative? and and going from there. And I think that there's been some really interesting scholarship that goes there, but I think that there can be some different methods and orientations to discussing it and to doing it. So kind of taking, I think it would be really interesting if scholars could take some data and write a traditional piece, but then use that same data to write it differently for a different audience, to kind of pull in more than just the expected readers of family communication scholarship, but to invite other types of readers, because family communication is an area that needs to be much more mainstream than it is.
Yeah, agreed. And one of the things I like that you brought up the social science aspects. A lot of times I notice that because you turn into an other reviewer, I think, where they're like, oh, well, he's gay, close enough, we'll put him with the black piece, to be like that kind of other reviewer. And I notice I'll have a positive response, but people will say things like, your variables, they're not family communication variables. And so I kind of question what that means. So what advice would you give to someone who is like you, whose work is refreshing, new, and innovative, and doesn't necessarily use the family communication variables? What kind of advice might you give to that person to find their footing in this field?
I think that, my advice would be to consider the ways that their work can be framed in an interdisciplinary lens, right? So don't feel bottled in, because when something is, family communication falls under interpersonal communication, but they're very rarely only those things. So what other, thinking about what does your work do that in addition to or beyond, the obvious, and try to pitch it accordingly, right? Mm-hmm. So how can you reach audiences outside of the people who are reading in a particular way, in particular journals, exclusively, so find ways of getting your work out there beyond just our discipline, so that we can think about how these conversations can happen within and without communication studies.
Great. All right, so final question. I've been asking everyone who does these interviews, what do you think is something in the family communication canon, or maybe something that we don't see in the family communication canon? It can be a classic work, it can be a newer work, but just whatever you want to pick, a book, an article, whatever. What do you think that family communication scholars should read?
You know what? I'm going to go a little bit off the grain here, because I think that sometimes we get so used to reading specific types of things that we ignore other examples, right? And so I think that I would challenge family communication scholars to read non-academic text as family communication text. So I'm thinking about novels. And so in particular, I'm thinking about a novel that I think gives a really interesting dynamic of family. And that's Toni Morrison's Sula. It's one of my absolute favorite books. And it is as much about family communication as it is about Black woman friendship and coming of age. So I think that if we will expand what we're willing to allow to count as scholarship, I think that could be that could offer really dynamic possibilities pedagogically, but also within our own research and citation practices. But my traditional answer to this, I think that the one of the pieces that I have most recently read within family communication research is the Miniar and Solis piece from last year about Black families. It's called, it was in the Journal of Family Communication. It's called Family Communication and Messages About Race and Identity in Black Families in the United States. And so it's a piece that helps to create an argument around how we're talking about or should talk about the unique experiences by families. And I think that piece is particularly resonant in this moment because, I think it's important for people to understand how Black families have to have particular types of conversations about identity and about Blackness and about discrimination and racism with each other and with their children, so that their children can make it home at night, you know. So I think that the research that attunes to that and that exposes that is really important.
Yeah, definitely. I also appreciate that it is a very readable article. And so it is something that I want to teach to my interpersonal communication students just as a general text.
Yes.
But it's a must, I think, for a grad seminar in family comm, no doubt.
Yes. Yes.
All right, cool. Well, that is it. Is there anything else you feel like you want to say or you need to say today?
No, I just really appreciate, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I appreciate you coming on and talking to us. And you will find links to both of her picks in the comments section. So go down, check those out. Once again, this was Dr. Robin Boylorn from the University of Alabama. Thank you so much. And join us for another episode of Family Conversations. Bye.